Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today for Sundays at Home, a time for conversation, camaraderie, and discovering more about the women who have helped shape our world that have been largely underrepresented in our historical narrative. My name is Emma Rothberg, and I'm the Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation at the National Women's History Museum. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended an NWHM program before, welcome back and thank you for your continued support. The National Women's History Museum exists to preserve, illuminate, and share the powerful history of women in America, highlighting both the past and present. NWHM seeks to ensure that women's history is available and accessible to learners of all ages across the globe. Before we begin, please allow me to go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel in the days following the event. Today's guests are available to answer your questions, so please use the Q&A feature on the tool ribbon to ask any questions that you may regarding the presentation. You may submit your questions at any time. When Miss was launched as a one-shot sample insert in New York Magazine in December 1971, few realized it would become the landmark institution in both women's rights and American journalism that it is today. 50 years ago this month, Miss hit newsstands as its own revolutionary magazine. The founders of Miss, many of whom are now household names, helped to shape contemporary feminism, with Miss editors and authors translating a movement into a magazine. The work of today's guests all centers on Miss Magazine, its past, present, and future. They have studied or directly contributed to the mission of the magazine and have all helped to answer the question, what does it mean to be feminist? I'm joined today by four very special guests: Kathy Spillar, Executive Editor of Miss, historian Beverly Guy-Sheftall, and historian Amy Farrell, and Carmen Rios, who will moderate this afternoon's conversation. So our moderator, Carmen Rios, is a feminist superstar who has spent more than a decade writing and broadcasting in pursuit of women's equality. She spent 3 years as the managing digital editor at Miss Magazine, where she remains a consulting digital editor, and has also written and recorded for platforms including Autostraddle, Bitch, Dame, Everyday Feminism, Feministing, Feminist Formations, Girl Boss, The Meteor, the National Women's History Museum, Signs, Sinister Wisdom, and the Women's Media Center. Carmen has been overheard on NPR, profiled by the New York Times, and spotted on CNN, Good Morning America, and the CBS Early Show, and her work has been covered by the Washington Post, Diva Magazine, Jezebel, Time, Nylon, and The Guardian. She's been praised by Longreads, Mashable, BuzzFeed, Curve, Logo, and The Rumpus, and cited or quoted by NBC, Daily Dot, Bustle, Romper, and Vox. You can follow her at Carmen Rios. We are grateful to have Carmen with us to moderate our conversation. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Kathryn Spiller. Spiller is the Executive Director of Feminist Majority Foundation and Feminist Majority, national organizations working for women's equality, empowerment, and nonviolence. One of the founders, Spiller has been a driving force in executing the organization's diverse programs, securing women's rights both domestically and globally since its inception in 1987. Spiller is the Executive Editor of Miss, which the Feminist Majority Foundation acquired in December 2001, becoming the sole nonprofit publisher of the iconic magazine. Under her oversight, Miss has increased its investigative reporting and in-depth analysis, and today is the largest print and online feminist news site reaching readers from across the globe. Via the quarterly print magazine, a vibrant and popular website, and podcast, On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin, a robust e-newsletter mailing list, and a social media following of more than 500,000. Miss's innovative digital textbook resources, Miss Classroom, covers current feminist topics and activism, and is used by instructors for all levels of women's and gender studies courses in hundreds of colleges and university programs across the country. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Beverly Guy-Sheftall. She is the founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center and Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College. For many years, she was a visiting professor at Emory University's Institute for Women's Studies, where she taught graduate courses in women's studies. At the age of 16, she entered Spelman College, where she majored in English and minored in secondary education. After graduating with honors, she attended Wellesley College for a 5th year of studying English. In 1971, she returned to her alma mater, Spelman College, and joined the English department. Beverly Guy-Sheftall has a PhD in American Studies from Emory University. She's published a number of texts within African American and women's studies, which have been noted as seminal works by other scholars, including the first anthology on Black women's literature, Sturdy Black Bridges, Visions of Black Women in Literature, which was published by Doubleday in 1980. She co-edited with Roseanne B. Bell and Betty Parker Smith. Her most recent publication is an anthology co-edited with Jonetta B. Cole called Who Should Be First? Feminists Speak Out on the 2008 Presidential Campaign. In 1983, she became founding co-editor of Sage, a scholarly journal of Black women, which was devoted exclusively to the experiences of women of African descent. She's the past president of the National Women's Studies Association and was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Amy E. Farrell. Farrell is the James Hope Caldwell Memorial Chair and Professor of American Studies and Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Dickinson College. She was most recently named a 2001, 2002 fellow, 2021 and 2022 fellow at Harvard Radcliffe Institute for her new work on the history of the Girl Scouts of the USA. The author of 2 books, Yours in Sisterhood, Miss Magazine and the Promise of Popular Feminism, and Fat Shame, Stigma and the Fat Body in American Culture. Her research focuses on the history of girls and women in the US, second wave feminism, representations of gender and feminism in popular culture, and the history and representations of the body and fatness, a topic for which she is interviewed frequently. Her recent media contributions include The New Yorker, International Business Times, The Atlantic, US News and World Report, CNN Online, Shape Magazine, and Psychology Today. She also was a 2-time guest on the Colbert Report. Farrell is a past recipient of an American Council of Learned Scholars Fellowship, and in 2005, she received the Distinguished Teaching Award, which recognizes excellence in teaching and is the highest honor given to a Dickinson College faculty member. I am so looking forward to this conversation. Please join me in welcoming Carmen, Amy, Beverly, and Kathy.
Thank you so much, Emma. I feel like I need a minute to recover from everyone's bios. It is such an honor to be here with you today. And to sort of get our conversation rolling, I would love to ask, all 3 of you to sort of place yourselves in the context of this magazine's own history. And so I'm curious, when did you all first encounter Ms. and what are some of the issues or articles across its 50 years that remain the most resonant or were the most meaningful to you? And Kathy, maybe you want to kick us off?
Thanks, Carmen. Thinking back, it was probably in the early 80s when I picked up my first issue of Ms. I had been following the battle around the Equal Rights Amendment a little bit, living here in California. In Los Angeles, this was not one of the states where the battle was most active, but I had been following it and thinking, who could possibly be against the Equal Rights Amendment, adding that to the Constitution? Such a simple statement, and was just shocked when June 30th, 1982 hit, and there was still 3 more states that had not ratified, and thinking that I guess it's time to get involved and help make this fight. Always knowing that the people who would fight the hardest for equality and for freedom were those most impacted by the discrimination. And so I got involved and quickly found my way to a feminist bookstore. It no longer exists, unfortunately, Sisterhood Bookstore, and found there a copy of Ms. Magazine and just began to devour it and every book I could get my hands on. And so it was a very, very important part of informing me about the movement, about the different issues that the movement was tackling, some of the key leaders in that period. So I learned a lot by reading Ms. and felt very connected to a larger community of feminists all across the United States. So it was just very important in my development.
I love it. And what about you, Beverly?
Okay. I was in 1971, 1972 in my first or second year teaching in the English department at Spelman College, the oldest historically Black college for women. And I was a magazine addict, and I was not selective in my magazine consumption. But I think I stumbled upon Ms. Magazine by accident. I mean, I'm already in the women's movement. I'm already an out Black feminist, and I'm already very much interested in teaching women's studies. I taught the first women's studies classes in the English department at Spelman. But one of the things that struck me, and I say this over and over again, and I think this was very unusual, is in 1972, Johnny Tillman's article in Ms. on welfare rights is a women's issue. So that was very, very early. And I think that was very important to me, because what it announced was that feminism or women's issues was not just about privileged white women who were frustrated, as Betty Friedan said, with marriage and motherhood. So the Johnny Tillman essay in an early issue of Ms. was very important in terms of keeping me reading Ms.
Wonderful. And Amy, what about you?
So when Ms. came out in 1971 with that inset in 1972, I was still a child. And growing up in Northern Ohio in a very conservative white family, and Ms. was not showing up in our house. But it was in the air. It was in the air so much that when the secretaries in my dad's office gave him a male chauvinist pig tie, we knew what that meant. And when I would say what things that my family thought were outrageous, they would call me Ms. You know, so I just mean it was so much in the environment that you didn't necessarily need to be reading it to be aware of it. My first actual awareness of paying close attention to the magazine, I really had started, being introduced to lots of different thinkers in college. And then when I went to University of Minnesota, outside of the Center for Advanced Feminist Studies office, I was getting an advanced degree in American Studies and Feminist Studies. There were all these Ms. magazines, and I started pouring through them and making my way to the feminist bookstore, then Amazon bookstore in Minneapolis. But at any rate, I started to devour those magazines and really thought about what were the kind of narratives around the magazine. So many of the stories about the magazine didn't turn out to be true when I actually read it. So for instance, that's so funny, Beverly, that you mentioned Johnny Tillman's article, because that for me has probably been the article that has stayed with me the longest of all the articles, because she also added in there, you know, if you're a fat woman, if you're a Black woman, if you're a middle-aged woman, you count for nothing as a person, you just count as a statistic. And that article has so many angles that I have continued to use in my work. But at any rate, I discovered it on this table, this messy, messy table outside of the Feminist Studies office. So that was my introduction. So that would have been in 1985.
I love it.
21. Yeah.
I'm like, I love it. I feel like I was handed my first issue of Ms. in college as well by the feminist group on campus. And I would basically end up picking my college based on the fact that this group appeared at this like student recruitment day. And I was like, a feminist group on campus, surely only this college has one of those. And that sort of fascination also as a magazine addict and being like, finally, a magazine that, you know, is talking about these real issues, has these feminist messages in it instead of the messages I was normally seeing in the magazines for, you know, teenage girls and young adult women. And I think, you know, it's such an example too, that obviously I would go on to find out that basically every college has a feminist group on campus and that FMF was supplying many of them with these magazines. And, you know, I think that sort of speaks to the growing accessibility of Ms. and sort of that contrast, Amy, too, of, you know, the people in your life sort of using it as this denigrating idea at the time, making fun of it, using Ms. as almost like an insult, as a word to tease you. And I do want to sort of start at this very beginning in 1972, when Ms. first hits newsstands as an insert. It creates this earthquake, and that might be difficult for people who are living in this current moment when feminism feels so sort of saturated and everywhere, to realize just how revelatory, how revolutionary it felt at the time for that magazine to be on the newsstand next to these other titles. And, you know, a lot of your research is about those early days of Ms. So could you sort of set the scene for us and let us know sort of what the context was in which Ms. emerged and what felt so, you know, brilliant and different about what it was offering?
Yeah, so Ms. emerged first as that inset in 1971, and then that spring preview issue in 1972. there was a lot of feminist activism happening at the time, lots of legislative changes. I mean, if we think about, Title IX in 1972, I mean, we connect Roe versus Wade with 1972, but there was so much abortion rights activism before then. There was just so much activism happening in those years before Ms. started, but the media landscape was pretty bleak. For feminists. There had been a sit-in at Ladies' Home Journal in 1970 to try to challenge the women's magazines. Women's magazines had a really tight formula of advertising supported, the articles supported the advertisements, and they were about purchasing products for housewives. And so Ms. was this kind of, the ways that Gloria Steinem and Patricia Carbine and the set of other editors who worked with them envisioned this was to really revolutionize and use all the monies from the advertising world to really break into mass media and go beyond what the small radical newsletters could be doing, because those really only reached people if you were already radical or if you happened to be connected. Like if I was friends with one of you and you showed me the magazine, this was just showing up at the grocery stores. When you were shopping, it would just be on the newsstand. And what I remind people is that there wasn't internet then. There wasn't internet then. So it wasn't like you could Google in something, like we've all Googled in just some question into the ether, right? And then you see that there are people who are wondering the same thing. There wasn't that. And so for a lot of women, and I would say primarily this is probably true for white women, who wrote to Ms. Magazine saying, Ms. saved my life. I thought I was crazy. I thought that I was the only one who thought this. And Ms. and I picked it up on the newsstand. In fact, one of the early kind of critics of the magazine, or commentators rather, called it a tarantula on the banana boat. Like it would show up in people, it just get popped into someone's grocery bag, go home, and it could revolutionize a whole world. The magazine would get passed around then, where people who were like, I just never thought of this before, or I've been thinking this, but I didn't have the words and the language for it. Ms. really created, was the source for articulating and popularizing the names of something that hadn't been named before, like for instance, sexual harassment. I think we can't underestimate what it meant to actually infiltrate the mass media at that time. What a powerful moment that was.
Definitely. And, obviously, while so many women and feminists felt seen and recognized by Ms. in a new way in those early days when it was first growing and starting, we also obviously know that second wave feminism fell short, especially on issues of race and class. And Beverly, your own academic work has often confronted those divisions and those shortcomings and also centered Black feminisms. And so I'm curious if you can sort of speak a bit to that complicated relationship that women of color and particularly Black women had with Ms. and the broader movement that Ms. was sharing with women in its pages. Ooh, hold on. I can't hear Beverly.
I'm sorry.
Oh. No, I think you're still muted.
Sorry.
There we go.
So let me give a context before we get to Ms. Feminism and the women's movement is perceived within even Black freedom struggles as divisive, detracting from the civil rights movement, and not anti-racist. So feminism and the women's movement are not embraced within the Black communities, even academic Black communities in the 60s and 70s. I mean, civil rights movement, Black power is raging, and women's movement and feminism are perceived to be antithetical to that, and also perceived to be a movement that will privilege already affluent white women. And the Betty Friedan book is a text that people associated, not me, it's people associated the Betty Friedan book with the so-called women's movement, which was perceived to be white, middle class, straight, Christian, US centered. And so that is the context. So out Black feminists like me and others, and even as the Black women's movement is happening, coming out of SNCC, for example, coming out of the Black Panther movement, those women were not associated with the mainstream so-called hegemonic women's movement. And in fact, Black feminist activism was not even a part of the narrative early on about the women's movement. So you could read about the women's movement, but what Black feminist activists were doing was just not there. And I'll say one other thing in this regard. Our Black feminists or our womanists like Alice Walker, who was associated with Ms. work there. Michelle Wallace was on the cover of Ms. with her Black macho and the myth of the superwoman. This actually exacerbated tensions within the Black community about Black feminism. So the argument was, we're traitors. We are over with this so-called white feminist movement. So what I'm talking about then is not Mrs. fault. What I'm talking about is the differential attitude about feminism and women's movement in the 60s and 70s. Even though in 1970, Toni Cade Barrett's A Black Woman has come out, even though I mentioned Johnny Tillman, it is really important to hear that feminism as a term, as a concept, in the women's movement was perceived to be not intersectional, not diverse, and not sufficiently committed to an anti-racist struggle. So, and I would say that hasn't totally gone away.
Right.
Okay. So I just want to say that, so that when Michelle Wallace appears on the cover of Ms., and that was one of the most hated books in the Black community, the Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. The thing was, see, you see. So I needed to say that.
No, for sure. And, just for folks who might not be familiar with the term, can you explain sort of what we mean when we talk about intersectionality in feminist spaces? And if there are ways in which the story of Ms. and the larger movement over the last 50 years sort of offer us models for what it might look like in practice, or models for what not to do in practice to really make intersectional feminism, possible.
Well, I would say Black women have always understood that oppressions in the US were multifaceted. Isms, racism, classism. We always knew that going back to the 19th century. And one of the things that bothered progressive Black women was this message that sexism or gender is the primary and maybe even original and universal aspect of what it means to be a woman, rather than saying that all of us have multiple identities, race and gender and class and sexual orientation and religion and national, and you cannot privilege or you cannot have a hierarchy of oppressions where you put sexism or gender oppression at the top. And so an intersectional feminist perspective would understand that all of these isms are related or interconnected, and that we need to simultaneously work on the elimination of all of them at the same time. So that's the easiest way to say what intersectional feminism is.
Thank you so much. And, Kathy, now that you are stewarding the magazine, obviously when FMF takes on publishing Ms., you inherit both, this powerful feminist media vehicle, as well as the struggles that feminists are always in to be in alignment with their own values in the work that they do. And so how have you sort of interpreted the legacy of Ms., and how have you maybe sought to expand or transform it? And in this particular moment when feminism does feel a little maybe present, when it's one of the most, Googled words, or, everyone is talking about it, and we're seeing feminist perspectives in other places. Why do you feel like a sort of a feminist media platform specifically like Ms. is still so critical?
There's a bunch of questions in there, Carmen. Let me start with why Ms. Magazine is now published by the Feminist Majority Foundation as a starting place. And Gloria Steinem and Marcia Gillespie, Marcia was the editor-in-chief of Ms., in the very late 90s, early 2000s, came to us in late 2000. Actually, it was in the middle of 2001, to ask if we would consider taking on publishing of Ms. Magazine. The magazine had been through a series of commercial publishers, which, exacerbates everything Amy was talking about to the 100th degree. Not only did they not understand the role that Ms. had played in exposing the larger population to these issues and in helping to shape the movement, but also had been shaped by the movement. And so it had been rescued one final time by Gloria Steinem in the late 90s, and they had reconstituted themselves as Liberty Media for Women. And even though they had initial investments of around $2.5 million by very committed feminists, and Marcia had done everything she could to stabilize the ship, just at that time, media was going through this tremendous, these changes. Magazines were going under every day, newsstands were closing. That was the beginning of the internet, and magazines were less and less desirable for people. And so in that context, they asked if we would take on Ms., because they always felt that not only was it part of the movement, but it literally should be in the movement, so that it was part of all of the activism and the research and the work that was being done in the movement to move forward towards equality. And so after quite a bit of time, we finally said yes. We just couldn't see the magazine going under. Bush had just been elected president. We were into another period of backlash, and we just couldn't stand the thought that the larger media would be able to say, see, we told you, feminism is dead, and Ms. going under is proof of it. And so we decided we had to reorganize it. Instead of a subscriber, you became a member of the Ms. community. We closed the New York City office, opened the editorial side in our Los Angeles office, and in our Washington, D.C. area office, put the publishing side, figuring we wanted the magazine to be located in a national political context, but also on the West Coast, where a lot of media is created. And so then we began publishing. We also knew, though, that we had to reconnect the magazine to the movement. And as you said, Carmen, we began to distribute it to our feminist groups on college campuses. But we also started going to all the big conferences, women's rights conferences of all kinds, and reconnected to the National Women's Studies Association. We felt that was just very important, that Ms. have a deeper connection to the academy that was doing so much groundbreaking research and publishing, and yet too much of it was just staying in journals, academic journals, and wasn't available to the larger public. And so we did a lot to restructure and reorient and rebuild in the hopes that we could sustain this really critical magazine and media, really, in this time of great challenges. And we opened up a website, Carmen, and you eventually took that on, and it now reaches millions and millions on an annual basis. And we have a very large social media following, so we're able to reach even more people in today's time with some of the same critical messages. And as the movement changed, Ms. changed. And I think that it has reflected that change over time. And that's how Beverly gets reconnected or connected. You always were in some way, but we reinvigorated the Committee of Scholars for Ms. And it's a majority women of color committee that we felt was critically important for all the reasons Beverly was just talking about. So I don't know if Beverly wants to take it from there in terms of what the Committee of Scholars has been able to help Ms. do.
Yeah, I think the reconnection, or the deeper connection, maybe the reconnection, and maybe even sort of beginnings, Kathy, of a deep connection with the Academy and Ms. And I would say particularly less prestigious places like HBCUs. I mean, generally speaking, HBCUs did not have women's studies programs. Community colleges, small liberal arts colleges with not the kind of resources, for example, that an elite white college had. So that was really, really important to broaden Mrs. connection to spaces that had not historically been attached to feminism or women's movement, and to bring, as Kathy said, many, many more scholars of color into the Ms. family or into the Ms. space. It has been extremely important. And I would say for many undergraduate college students, they would not have been introduced to feminist anything unless Ms. had been brought into those spaces. So that was extremely important. And I think also having a large number of women of color scholars attached to Ms. has been extremely important too. And also, Kath, I don't know what I would say, also the more global reach of Ms. as a result of that has been very, very important too.
Right, and we remain very committed to its global reach because, you know, feminist movements all around the world were doing extraordinary things to combat patriarchy and the oppression of women in all different contexts. And we felt it was just critically important that Ms. continue what the original editors had started, was to report and to have writers in different countries, in different cultures, writing about the work that was happening on the ground. And we always felt that, you know, not only could we learn from the strategies that were being employed, but to have those connections to US-based feminists, we thought were very, very critical. And Ms. has provided that kind of a community where those voices have a place to write and to spread ideas and to be in community with other feminists around the world. So it's been very, very important.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we talk about sort of what feminists can be learning from each other and how they can be showing up in solidarity with each other too, obviously you touched, Kathy, on the fact that activism and you know, political movements and movement building has always been at the heart of Ms. And, you know, that movement piece is obviously so critical and needed to this day. And so, you know, how is Ms. able to respond right now in this difficult moment that we find ourselves in terms of things sort of maybe even coming full circle somewhat, unfortunately, in the context in which Ms. emerged and what we're seeing happening now? I'm thinking particularly about, you know, with the fall of Roe.
Well, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this because, you know, 50 years of access to legal abortion, and yet in many communities, the access really wasn't there, obviously. Right. And I think that Ms. has been part of bringing that to the forefront during this period, that it has been Black women especially, and in the South, that have been cut off from the kinds of resources that were needed, and to feature the larger issue of reproductive justice, which I think is, you know, was a concept that came out of the Black feminist community, that it's not just about abortion, it's about access to contraception. It's also about being able to have children and to raise children in a safe environment, and to have the resources and the support of the larger community and being able to raise children of your choice. And so I think Ms. has been a great place to bring those evolving concepts and the larger concepts to its readership and to the feminist community. And, you know, we're much stronger today as a movement or movements than we were 50 years ago. There's, first of all, feminists are a majority identity in the country, with the highest rating of being a feminist among Black women, followed by Latinas, and then followed by white women. And we're in better positions politically in terms of power which we're watching play out in Congress and in some of these state legislatures. And yet, of course, we're underrepresented, which is why we are able to see these terrible laws passed and the bans. But also, Ms. has continued then to be a place where people could come for information and resources. We've highlighted the availability of the abortion pill, which I think really changes the nature of abortion access in this period, but also a place where calls to action and, again, bringing out the different issues involved so that feminists who are fighting for reproductive justice everywhere can feel they can find something in the pages of Ms. to help strategize and inform and to continue to spread ideas, which has always been Ms's strength. You can't have a movement just with demonstrations and precedent-setting litigation. The ideas are what are so important, and reaching people with those ideas so that they can organize in their communities is some of the most critical work that Ms. has ever done, I think.
For sure. And, Amy, much of your research also focused on the challenges that Ms. faced when it was advertisement supported, and that was where a majority of their publishing revenue was coming from, and sort of how the constraints that were put on the magazine and the tension that capitalism created in terms of its mission and its ability to build and shape the feminist movement. And so I was wondering if you could speak to, what those challenges looked like, how they impacted the magazine, and sort of how we see those same constraints shaping the mainstream media coverage that we see of the issues we're facing in this moment.
Yeah, that's a great connection at the end too. It's that follow the money question always. But I think it's really important when we think about the origins of Ms. too, that the women who started Ms. had kind of two they had a lot of levels of revolutionary thinking there, or just where the possibilities they were imagining. One was that it was a women's organization. So they were only pulling in women to work on the editorial side. And that was relatively easy because lots of women were writers and editors up to that point. But what was more difficult was actually to pull in women on the publishing side, on the business side. So that is actually one thing, Pat Carbine, I think, her name doesn't get named enough in all of this, and how she really would only hire women. And and so they had a constant turnover as the women who were trained to go sell advertisements, they were actually often spit on in meetings. Just like, why would we want to put our money into a feminist magazine? And so what would happen though is they got training under fire. And then as the world was changing, all these other companies would pick them up and be able to pay them a lot more. And Pat Carbine said that was part of her job, was to start to create a pipeline where women were being pushed into the publishing world. So I think that's something interesting to think about as sort of that Ms. funneled and changed the face of publishing as well. But in terms of advertisers, the imagination was that they would actually be able to use advertising dollars to fund the movement, that there would be so much money that would be able to come in through advertising that you could actually fund the movement. It turned out to be the opposite. And the Ms. Foundation for Women had to be actually funding the magazine. Advertisers, they refused to accept ads that were derogatory or dangerous for women. And they would make the decisions about that, or that required really strict complementary copy, meaning like some article that actually isn't really journalism, just supports the advertisement. And the reality was, though, they had such a difficult time getting advertisements, people to believe that it was important to advertise in a feminist magazine. The biggest advertisers ended up being cigarettes and alcohol. And so that was probably one of the biggest losses of Ms., which was as all the information was coming out about how extraordinarily dangerous cigarettes were and how the tobacco companies had covered up that information. Ms. never ran those stories while other magazines were, because they couldn't afford to. The argument was they really couldn't afford, if they didn't accept those advertising dollars, they would have folded. And I suspect that's a great regret for all of those editors from that time. The other thing, I think they really hoped that they'd be able to change the advertising landscape, like to actually say to a company, your ad campaign is offensive, let's change it. And the reality was they just were not able to do that. They also had to continually prove that the audience, this really goes to what Beverly was talking about though as well, they had to prove that the audience were good purchasers of, say, cigarettes or underarm deodorant or plane tickets. And in order to do that, the companies wanted certain kinds of, they didn't really care if anyone read, but they just wanted certain consumers that they were buying really. And so those people needed to be moneyed. They needed to be proved that they were good consumers. And the presumption was that they will be white as well and not too radical. And so Ms. actually, while it would put certain kinds of things on the cover, I remember in an interview with some of the editors saying we actually would bury our more radical articles in the magazine in hopes that the advertisers wouldn't actually read them. Or I was talking about the example the other day when there was a wonderful cover of dissidents from the USSR, from the Soviet Union, and advertisers started pulling out because why did you put those ugly women on the cover? They weren't ugly women. They were women who weren't coiffed in lots of makeup and etc. So it was a constant battle. There was also a wonderful section in the magazine called No Comment, where readers would send in advertisements and other articles that they found really offensive, and Ms. would put it in with no comment. But the funny thing in terms of all the letters to Ms. are collected from those first 20 years at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe at Harvard. And lots of women sent in ads from Ms. So, and obviously Ms. didn't publish their own ads, but I mean, it was they knew those were coming in though. So editors really knew that was a tension there. And they, I don't know, I think some editors were just themselves not socialists. They really thought they could make a kind of deal with capitalism. But socialist feminists were pretty cut out of Ms. So Ellen Willis, for instance, had some articles early on, but then she was just really not wanted. There were another editor an African-American editor by the name of Margaret Sloan really brought a much more a Black socialist perspective. And I think there were a number of reasons that she was not comfortable there, but I think that was another one of those reasons. So the advertising, the only thing I would say is though, what's lost without the advertising and without being in that world, the landscape is so different now, but when it left that by the 90s even, it just wasn't competing in quite the same way on the newsstand. Like it wasn't, it moved into a different space where it was freer to speak, including to be international. Advertisers hated the international stuff because they weren't selling their deodorant to someone in India. They hated that, and that was what they would say, really horrible things like that. So, but there was some level where it was, the vision that you could get in there and can compete in that world was pretty fascinating, even if in the end they lost that battle. But I would also say part of it was the media landscape was also changing so much that they were the first to go. They were almost like the canary in the minefield. They were the first to go, that it was impossible. But as we saw, magazines, et cetera, were all newspapers, that kind of deal between advertising and journalism was falling apart by that time. I don't think people had their fingers on that at that point, including me when I wrote my book. I mean, I don't think we understood what was coming.
Right. And I think, oh, sorry, Kathy, did you want to say something?
No, I just that it's been the advantage of a nonprofit model though, too. And a lot of media now is converting from for-profit to nonprofit, even local newspapers who are finding it very tough to survive now that the internet exists and they don't get the help wanted ads or any of the other ads that they relied on for so long are now converting to a nonprofit model. And, beginning in the 90s, as you said, Amy, Ms. really became a reader-supported publication and has been able to survive with help from, we can now get foundation funding, major donors who want to see the magazine exist can give money. And so it's been a way that we've been able to not only keep Ms. going, but to build it larger and stronger and to increase its reach. It's been through this nonprofit model, which more and more journalism is now taking on.
Right. And I think, I want to circle back to this idea of like what it frees you up to do, and also the power that comes not only just from a nonprofit model, but the fact that Ms. is also now sort of nestled in this larger nonprofit that has a larger mission, has broader, had established and broader connections. And it makes me think too about the sort of influx, the use of Ms. as an educational tool, and the ways that you've been able to focus on turning Ms. into a deliberate educational tool with readers and, the Ms. Classroom program and distribution to college students and college groups. And Beverly, I was wondering if you could speak a little too to, what has come from maybe a growing dialogue between academic feminism and sort of the activist feminism that, maybe was always present in Ms., and how it's sort of, how that relationship has strengthened the feminist movement, and in your opinion, how it's changed, the dialogue that Ms. is able to have.
I think it might be, and I'd be interested to hear what Kathy has to say. I would say that Ms. probably has a closer connection to academic feminism now than activist feminism. That is when I'm around my activist feminist comrades in particular kinds of organizations, they are less likely to talk about Ms. Than my academic feminist comrades who are on college campuses, because Ms. is on college campuses. So it might be, Kathy, a good idea for us to try to figure out how to have more connections to feminist activist organizations that are not in the academy. You want to say something about that?
Well,
Kathy?
yeah, and actually, Beverly, I'd love to have that conversation with you, because we're, Ms. is 50 years old this year, and we're using this as an opportunity to reach out to activist organizations and figure out ways we can collaborate, that they can bring Ms. to their activist base, and we can profit, not in the money sense, from the feedback that we get and the participation that we get. We do have activist organizations involved, but they tend to be more national groups, because those are the tables that we're sitting at, the different coalition tables, but we do have leading activists who write for the magazine.
Right.
But more and more, I think you're right. We've developed this very deep relationship with the academy, and Ms. always, Ms. was launched about the same time that women and gender studies was becoming an academic discipline. And so they've really grown together, but we do have this deep connection, and I'd like to see more of that on the activist side. I couldn't agree more. And maybe you've got good ideas too for groups we should be reaching out to.
Well, I'm thinking about BYP 100, for example, which self-identifies as a queer Black feminist organization. They are really, and I'm thinking of, and they are also younger. And I'm thinking about Black Women's Blueprint, which is in New York and has a reproductive justice agenda. So I'm thinking about those kinds of mobilizations that I think of, and they have gatherings. So I think it wouldn't be difficult to do that.
Great. Yeah, because it is not only important for the magazine, but it's important that we are getting information on what's happening within the different movements and organizations, and being able to bring that out. It's the first time a lot of the general readers hear about things. So it's very, very important that we have those connections. We'll talk a lot more.
Well, and I think too, like this idea that Ms. and women's studies are sort of emerging at the same time. And I also think the feminist movement, especially sort of when the internet allowed these ideas to proliferate, sometimes in, ways where the information maybe wasn't super accurate, but sort of this idea that the academic language of feminism has sort of become mainstreamed in movement spaces. I think when we talk about a term like intersectionality, something that was originating in the academy that now is basically, oh, you're going to see it in tons of feminist spaces that have maybe even no direct connection to women's studies, to feminist academia. And Beverly, I feel like as you've sort of had these boots on the ground as well as been in the academic world, like how have you seen the ability for feminist academia to be in the pages of Ms. sort of shaping the broader movement and the direction that it's been growing in?
One thing I think we need to say, there's a huge backlash now. I mean, a huge backlash. I mean, the backlash against critical race theory.
Right.
Which I mean, that's Kimberly Crenshaw who coined the term, not the concept. I think that we need to be in conversation about how to combat this huge backlash. I mean, it is serious. The other thing that I just really have to say is we have and I'm talking about now the women's movement, feminist movement. When I see the huge numbers of right-wing women who were critical in the last election, when I see the co-chair of the January 6th hearings who voted against the Voting Rights Act and who was anti-Roe versus Wade, even though she's on the right side in terms of Trump. That says to me that there's more that we need to do. These midterm elections are going to be huge. The next election is going to be huge. And when I speak to friends of mine, white friends of mine, who tell me that everybody in their family are going to vote Republican the next time, so we've got a lot of work to do in terms of figuring out and large numbers of women who are not angry about Roe versus Wade because of religious reasons. And so many of those are African-American women, by the way. Black women, for example, are some of the women who get abortions, but who espouse an anti-abortion rhetoric. So we've got to do some strategizing about how to impact those women.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the conversation definitely needs to not only continue, but almost, somehow become more impactful, more broad reaching. Yes. More resonant. And I think, Kathy, that was a question I wanted to ask you too, was, not only what are the ways in which you're marking this anniversary, what's coming next, but also when you envision, the future of Ms. and what you're trying to build, especially in, I feel like I keep saying in this imperiled moment, but it's basically been an imperiled moment for like 6+ years. But, like what do you sort of hope and strive to make possible for Ms. as it enters its 51st year and beyond?
Well, one thing we've done is we've developed new media outlets for Ms. Ms. Studios, which is helmed by Michelle Goodwin, and she is the host and executive producer of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin, which is one of the top 2% podcasts in the country. It's been very, very popular. And we intend to have more podcasts because more and more people are consuming news and ideas in that way. But we're very particular on the podcast that we're doing. We're actually working with Dorothy Roberts right now to do a whole series around her new book. We have different ideas than your typical podcast, but I think there's such hunger for the kind of information and conversations that we're able to have in that space. And we are also doing more and more, obviously on the website, more and more multimedia partnerships so that we can explore some of these key issues in more depth. And of course, our connections to the college campuses. The young people's vote in this midterm election could make or break so many of the close races. And, we've got to make sure that Ms. is helping get past the anger and the disappointment that many young people especially are feeling right now. And to understand that we've got a gridlocked Senate. You can't get anything through the Senate. You can get great stuff done in the House, and it's dying in the Senate. And what's the workaround there? We've got to break the filibuster. We've got to break these old systems of political power that were put in place by white men to sustain their power and their vision of what this country should be. And it's a different country, and yet we don't have that kind of political power. So, Ms. has got a key role to play in making sure people understand the political structures that are holding us back and how their participation can change things. I think that's our biggest challenge right now, even as we're fighting this backlash, Beverly. It's so worrisome.
And I was actually thinking in there as well, with all the battles that are going on regarding access to information for young kids, like what we can be teaching and
Right.
and I was thinking actually of your story, Carmen, and my story of actually of being in college or in graduate school where we got access to this, how important it is for people to have access to ideas. So Kathy, your point and Beverly about getting into other spaces and ensuring at the very least that people have access to the ideas. That they can flick on a radio and hear something, or they can easily just stumble upon it, and I think that is, it's not that doesn't mean that we aren't targeted in what we're doing. What I mean by that is that you're targeted in ways that people can stumble upon it, is really, I think, key. And the very fact that there's so much pressure going on right now to control what information kids get, I think indicates the power of having access to different perspectives.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I think, I sort of coming in on the digital side at Ms. and focusing sort of on almost digital feminisms in my work has so largely been about access to, this idea of like, well, there's a central place now where so many people can go to find this information. And obviously, I mean, I feel like if you asked me now how I feel about the potential for digital technology to change our world, it would probably not be as optimistic as it was, 10 years ago, because we're now also seeing such orchestrated backlash online, as well as digital tools being manipulated and used by, white nationalists and disinformation campaigns, and sort of that, makes even the ability for Ms. to be in all these spaces so much more critical, because there needs to now be, the Ms. on the newsstands, but also on social media and, on Google when people are looking for information and finding these, finding Breitbart instead of a reliable, feminist source that will tell the truth about what's happening in women's lives. And, I just, before we switch over to audience cues, I see them rolling in, so I'm excited. I wanted to just ask everyone sort of one more personal question to close it out about your own personal feminist histories this time, and sort of just what has Ms. meant to you all as feminists? What has it meant to have Ms. be here for the last 50 years while you were doing the work you were doing, while you were in the spaces that you were occupying?
Well, I can just quickly say, as an academic, on college campuses, Ms. has enabled me to make feminism more palatable to young African-American college women who sometimes find the highly theoretical, highly abstract, highly academic feminist writings that I also use less accessible. So I think Ms. is the writings in Ms. are more accessible and better able for young college women between the ages of 18 and 22 who have not grown up reading the way we grew up reading.
Right.
Has made that better.
And I'll jump in next. Since we took on publishing of Ms., I have to say I've learned more than I did in reading all those issues in the 80s and 90s. because we've got such incredible writers who bring the ideas to us. There's just so many aspects of this movement writ large that I have a much deeper understanding of today by working with the people who are, on the front lines of those battles. And I think it's been just highly, informative, not only to me, but I hope to those who read Ms. We've brought new ideas, new issues to the fore that, don't get published anywhere else really in any depth. And I hope it's helping to inform all the different aspects of this intersectional movement for how we can construct a path forward in these times.
And what about you, Amy?
Well, for me, I think, especially thinking as an activist today, as a scholar today, but also as a historian, that it's really something to be marking the 50th anniversary of this institution. That is a significant achievement, and that the institution grew and transformed when it looked like it was the pressures on it, it was going to be killed. And it was like, we're not dead yet, we're coming back, and feminism is there's always been this, there's lots of funny memes about that, about like feminism dead in 1920 and then it's dead. And, so we keep going and it's like, no, it's not dead. And I think looking at Ms. and, one thing I think we didn't mention for our listeners too, is thinking just how very important that name was of Ms. That the title was about making space for women who weren't necessarily identified by their relationship to men, as Miss or Mrs. does. And that really, what does that mean to be identifying women as full human beings, not identified with their relationship to men? And I think Ms. has also, I think we've seen the kind of development of intentional intersectional feminisms, even though we have places to go, that there's certainly that's the goal. And so that's what it's meant to me, is really, it's for me looking at that 50-year achievement, and also hearing Beverly and Kathy today thinking about where we're going now, is good. It's great. It's good to hear that. And you as well, Carmen. So the three of you think about where we're going now. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I was going to say, like, Kathy, you mentioned finding Ms. in a feminist bookstore. We know that there are not many of those anymore. And, when we talk about attacks on, women's studies and critical race theory, it's like there's also now fewer spaces, even in educational environments, to access these kinds of communities. And I feel like the bliss of working at Ms. and being in that feminist space of, it's just, that you're not going to be alone. You don't have to explain like why you feel a certain way, and you don't have to entertain that there might be an opposing argument to your rights. And you don't have to, it's just so powerful that there is a feminist institution that is still standing and strong and supported by its own community. I think and especially because we find ourselves in this moment now, as even a lot of feminist publications are no longer, sustained because they couldn't make the funding work, or, feminism was over, so they thought their work was all done. And it's just, it is so incredible to celebrate 50 years and know that moving forward, we will still have that space where we can know that, we're not crazy and we're not alone in feeling the way that we feel. So,
Carmen, I'll just, before we hit the question period, is, one of Ms's great strength has been that it's an intergenerational publication. We have a regular series written by teenagers called The Future is Ms. And we get letters from 9-year-olds saying that they read Ms. And from 90-year-olds that, they still follow Ms. And we have people who come to us to say they've got the entire 50 years of the magazine and in their collections. I think that has been a real strength of the magazine over this whole period, and now of its larger social media and digital media and audio, and we'll hopefully even get into video for Ms. Studios. But I think it's a great strength, and we're celebrating the 50 years. We're publishing a book next year with Knopf. It's going to feature some of the most iconic and groundbreaking articles of the 50 years, and the covers and the letters to the editor and other aspects so that people can have a book that they can, read some of these key articles over the years that have appeared and see the evolution of the movement and the ideas of this movement. So we're really thrilled about that.
Fantastic. And I believe if people click on the link that was dropped in the chat before and sign up for their free year of Ms., they will also be one of the first folks who can pre-order that book. So just saying, plug in that link in the chat. And thank you all so much. I'm like, Emma, I'll bring you back out to do Q&A if you're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much again for giving your time and your expertise. So we do have a few questions. And first, I just wanted to start with actually a small story that someone shared in the Q&A. Marty Maskell shared this story. She said that in 1972, she was 27. She lived in Ashland, Kentucky, and felt very isolated. Armco Steel had hired me as a computer specialist. That meant I became a member of the management club, which was 500 men and me. I stumbled on Miss in the newsstand and it was a lifeline. I still remember the I Want a Wife article and the Housewives moment of truth. I've been a fan of Ms. ever since. So just, I wanted to share that because you had all shared kind of how you'd stumbled upon Ms. At first and Marty was sharing as well. So the next question that came in is kind of related to this conversation about, what's going on now. And I'm paraphrasing the question, but how can Ms. contribute to having conversations about current events through a feminist lens, right? How does Ms. get people talking?
Well, it's what we do. Hopefully whoever asked that question becomes part of the conversation, both on social media, very active social media people, tweet, quote, retweet, interact with us in all sorts of ways on Facebook to some extent, but also by letting us hear from you, especially if you've got ideas and strategies that you're pursuing in your own community that you think could inform the larger movement for how we move forward. But it's pretty much what we think about every day is how can what we publish on the website, and we publish, by the way, probably 150 pieces a week on the website, opinion pieces, in-depth analysis of current issues across the board, interesting pieces on both culture, politics, economics. I mean, we cover the waterfront, which I think has also been a real strength of Ms. So, as we move in, as we're now caught in this huge backlash, we're trying to focus on what is the information that we can provide that gives people ideas and hope and strategies for moving forward and for fighting back. How can we fight back effectively? And not make some of the same mistakes that we've made in the past. What are some ways forward? And we're constantly thinking of that as we recruit articles for the magazine and for the website and for the podcast. So if people have ideas, they should let us know.
I also am thinking about, Ms. is a very small but mighty team that puts that magazine together, and yet there is a very robust fact-checking process. There's a lot of commitment to integrity, accuracy. And so, even though Ms. has a perspective, I would also argue that, like, if you're looking for true, actual facts to use in the arguments that you're having with people who don't agree with you or the arguments you're making to make the case for something, it's just so valuable to have a place where, the study that we're referencing is not like a poll that happened on Fox News at 5 p.m. on it's everything is just really factual. And I think that commitment is so important in this moment too, to combat disinformation and misinformation, to be able to say, Ms. is a resource where I can find real information about what's happening that I can spread, but also just, to become more informed and see a more whole picture.
And Carmen and Emma, the other thing I would say is that a real dedication of ours is to understand the role of gender in the larger backlash. I mean, we are seeing autocracies and autocratic leaders rise around the world. We're seeing the attacks on our own democracy. I mean, January 6th was just the most memorable attack on democracy, but in fact, it's much broader than that. And to understand the role of gender in all of that is a key responsibility that we've taken on at Ms. so that people can understand more deeply what we're up against, frankly.
Thank you so much for that answer. And kind of related to this, another question that came in was, what is one group besides the feminist majority that all concerned Ms. Mag readers can be connected to? So are there groups out there that you would want to highlight for readers of Ms.?
Any group that's working to fight sexism and racism and homophobia is part of this larger movement. So, look for, we always, by the way, do the best we can to feature the groups that are doing the work on the ground, so that when you see an article in Ms. or on the website, or that you can get connected to that group that's doing the work. We've always felt that's very important. This work is not being done by anonymous. And so we include that in all of our work and reporting, but you should be able to find a feminist group in literally every community. Literally every community is working to combat sexism and racism and homophobia, and those are the groups to get involved with.
I want to name in this regard the African American Policy Forum, which Kimberly Crenshaw co-founded. They right now, I would say they are leading the fight against the backlash against critical race theory. And I would get on their website and see all of the things that African American Policy Forum is doing around intersectional feminism and Black freedom struggle. African American Policy Forum.
And I would also just give a shout out to a project that I was really fortunate enough to be part of this year, the Anti-Bigotry project at Boston University. And under the kind of general purview of Ibram Kendi, but it was activists from around the country and world who worked on so many different aspects of bigotry. And that project is pretty amazing. So I would say if anyone can just Google that in, Anti-Bigotry Project, Boston University. I would also say, just to speak to what both Beverly and Kathy were saying too, if you get on an organization like NARAL or something, the National Abortion Rights Action League, almost every organization now has their national stuff, but then you can click on to like your zip code, because that's what, I mean, the national is really important, but also it's so important to be getting involved locally. The other shout out I give is the New York Times just had a great article, was it a week ago or something, on feminist bookstores around the country, the resurgence of them. And I thought, wow, now that's a place to go get information and get, because that they'll have all this stuff up on the bulletin board about what's going on now too. And to actually, if you want to go meet people in the flesh, if you want something beyond something that's online. So.
Thank you so much for that information. Those all sound like great organizations. And I personally appreciate the information, as does our audience. So another question that came in was, we've talked about, many of you have touched on anti-racism, all of these ideas of intersectionality, and that how some of the early history of Miss, there was tensions around, how do you work with advertisers and also work with these larger groups. So someone has asked how anti-Semitism possibly played a role in that early history of Miss, or that intersectionality that you've all been speaking about so eloquently.
Well, I know one of the earliest editors was Letty Cotton Pogrebin, who's really probably known in many spaces, mostly for her work in terms of thinking about Jewish life and Jewish feminist life and anti-Semitism. So I think that was definitely in the mix of what was being of a major concern for Ms. from its origins. I'm speaking to those first 20 years, especially.
I think Ms. has always tried to take on all the isms and really was at the forefront many times in providing information and insights. Ms. was talking about the attacks on lesbian mothers very early and their struggle to keep custody of their children in a divorce situation. I think Ms. tried over the years to address how racism and sexism intersected in certainly in the welfare system and the child welfare system. Most recently, Black Lives Matter in the defund movement, had some brilliant pieces written. Ms. tried to be at the forefront of so many of these battles for the rights of domestic workers, for the fight for 15 on economic issues. And so I think, Ms. has tackled these issues over its time because we see it as, and I think Ms. always did, all these issues interconnected. They are all part of sustaining this patriarchy here in the US and worldwide. And so being able to understand that, I think has been a key aspect of the growth of this movement.
Yeah, I also would add, and sort of connecting this also to the last question is, I know that when I was working at Ms. and that this work has sort of continued of building these partnerships that Kathy's talking about. And these are, editorial partnerships. Sometimes they're more action-oriented partnerships. But I would say, if folks are looking for organizations tackling certain issues from a feminist lens or a lens that includes gender, that the Ms. archives, even on the website, are such a powerful way to just, find those groups. And I'm saying this because I know that, when I was sort of full-time as the managing digital editor was when we started, I started in 2015. So we started seeing that resurgence in really vocal, very public, very unabashed white supremacism that obviously had roots and brought back very vivid memories of anti-Semitism that, we saw give rise to fascism during World War II. And so, I know that we've fostered a lot of partnerships with specifically groups that were focused on feminist justice from a Jewish lens. I'm thinking of Maison. I know, like not only tackling anti-Semitism, but also tackling, issues of race, class, gender with that lens and sharing that sort of interfaith message of, feminism is a movement that includes all of us.
Thank you so much for that answer. And just, I guess, as something to end our conversation on today, if you could leave our audience with kind of one thing, one kernel about Ms., its past, present, or its future, what would it be? And this is for everyone.
I'm sorry. I'll just quickly say, Ms. has sounded an alarm button. I mean, I'm remembering that the issue, the battered woman image. Remember that issue. I would say it has sounded alarm buttons, and I would say that right now, from my vantage point, the U.S. is in the worst moment. And I'm saying this as a person who grew up in the Jim and Jane Crow South in Memphis, Tennessee, and drank water out of colored water fountains and couldn't get a legal abortion and couldn't go to Emory University. But I would say that right now, this country is at a very dangerous point. And we need to sound the alarm button as Ms. Has done. And we need to get up and be active, do something. And the first thing, of course, is to get ourselves out and vote in the midterm elections and so forth. But we're in dangerous, scary times. And so I would say that that's what Ms. has reminded us, and I can't imagine a more dangerous time than right now. And it's not just about the elimination of Roe versus Wade, it's the fascist move and the large numbers, millions of Americans who seem to not be understanding of this moment.
I couldn't agree more with Beverly. She made a point and hit her computer.
That was a mic dropping, so
That's a way to emphasize your message there, Beverly. But I couldn't agree more. We're in such a precarious moment in this country. I always keep saying, we have to keep fighting, though. We have no choice. And if Ms. can help inform that fight and be the connection between ideas coming out of the academy and activists and just people who come across it on the web or they listen to a podcast, then I feel that we're helping to contribute in figuring out a way forward out of this period that we're in, because it is a very, very dangerous period. And Ms. can play a really key role in helping people understand it, not only how we got here and the components, but how do we move forward? What's the way forward? And we're very dedicated to that. I hope we can live up to that.
Yeah, and I would say when I look back in its history, the best of Ms. has been bold. If I were going to make a judgment on those first 20 years, it's when it felt like it couldn't be bold, and it pulled itself back. And just to speak to what Beverly and Kathy were saying now, obviously this is a time to be bold. It does, and that Ms. is an institution that is well placed to be that way. That there's no time to be shrinking back or to be afraid of controversy, because that we just already lost, if we're afraid of that. So it doesn't mean that there might not be missteps or there might not be, the wrong, whatever course corrections that need to be made or whatever, but that the boldness has been the best of Ms. has been bold. And just its imagination to even start was a bold move, so it's sort of like to build on that legacy.
I also think one of the most powerful things I learned at Ms. and one of the most powerful things that we sort of strove to communicate was this idea that, we live in this individualist society and that movements are not built or made by individuals, that, collectivism is how movements are built and shaped, and it's on all of us and not, one person who's going to do all of the work and suddenly they'll change the world, that it's really up to every individual person to come together. And that really, always helps me find some hope, this idea that all of us have a part to play, even if, we live in a culture where you might only hear stories of one extraordinary woman. There's always, hundreds of extraordinary women who were part of that moment in history that you're learning about from that perspective. And knowing that there are so many of us who are part of this movement and that, we are the majority.
Thank you all so much for leaving us with those uplifting notes and for giving our audience and those who will listen later the courage to go forth and make a change. So I want to thank you, Carmen, Kathy, Beverly, and Amy, so much for lending your expertise and your time. It's been a fabulous conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I know our audience has too. And I want to thank our audience for joining us here again this afternoon. It's our great pleasure to spend Sunday afternoons in conversation with inspiring guests in our museum community. If you enjoyed today's program, then please mark Sunday, August 14th on your calendars, when the museum will be hosting a conversation on the history of the abortion debate in the United States with special guests, Professor Mary Ziegler, Deborah Gray White, and Sarah Dubow. Will be moderated by Professor Michelle B. Goodwin, and that event starts at 2 p.m., not our normal time of 3. For a full listing of our upcoming programs and for registration information, please visit the Public Programs and Events tab at www.womenshistory.org. All events are free, but advanced registration is required. So again, thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. And until next time we meet, please stay safe and healthy and happy Sunday. Bye, everyone.